I've prepared a little source sheet for us. Because I had a great question, a great observation from one of my students this week. We're really going to focus on the source sheet, but the observation, it did all start in the Eitz Chaim Chumash for Parashat Shlach Lecha, page 840. And if you want to follow along with your eyes to this part of the teaching in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, page 840, there's the above the line commentary where it says, "Scouts are chosen." And so one of my students this week drew my attention to this comment, which reads, "According to the tradition recorded in Deuteronomy, the initiative to scout the land originated with the people, not God. That constituted a breach of faith because God already had scouted the land, so to speak. Hence, because Moses approved of the expedition, Moses was condemned with the people to die in the wilderness." All right, so backing up for a second, we're probably all aware of this by this point, but this week's parasha contains the famous and infamous story of the spies. Moses sends 12 spies to go scout the land of Canaan, the land that God has already promised to the Jewish people. They bring back bad reports, and God says, okay, this is not a good situation. This whole generation is going to wander for 40 years in the wilderness and die out before ever coming into the promised land. Okay, so this is a really bad situation, to put it extremely gently, and I'm not trying to be flippant, but it comes out that way because this is a failure of leadership, and it's a failure of faith, and it's a failure of a lot of things. And how do we understand this? And so we were coming into class this week, my students are asking this question, what is the deal with the spies? How could this possibly have happened? And this is essentially the question that we ask every year as we read this parasha. And the reason why this comment that my student noticed got my attention so much is because it is sort of the opposite of what the text actually reads. And if you have studied with me on Thursday mornings, you know that one strong theme in our learning is we look at what does the text say, what does the commentary say, and we make sure we know which is which. So, which brings us to the beginning of our source sheet and the question, whose idea was this? Whose idea was this that we go scout the land? Was it the people's idea, or was it God's idea? So we start with the first two sentences of our parasha, and I'll read in English. God spoke to Moses saying, "Send agents or spies or scouts to scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelite people. Send someone from each of their ancestral tribes, each one a chieftain among them." Okay, so this seems pretty clear. God's the one giving the command. That's what the text seems to say. But we have this phrase, shlach lecha. So we could translate it as send, but we've got this seemingly extra word, lecha. How do we interpret this? It kind of invites interpretation. And so we have, if you look closely at page 840 or Eitz Chaim Chumash, we have a number of different commentaries. And this inspired me to look at the baseline correct answer. The baseline correct answer for all commentaries, which we know is Rashi, that's the correct answer. And so you'll see that Rashi is throughout this source sheet. And that's the traditional baseline correct answer. If we're not really sure what it means, if we've got a variety of interpretations, Rashi is our baseline correct answer because Rashi is known by our tradition, understood by our tradition to bring pshuto shel mikra, the simple meaning of the verse. And it's always interesting when Rashi brings something that is a little bit not so simple. It's a little bit interpretive, and that's definitely what we see in this situation. So let's look at Rashi on our verse, chapter 13, verse 2. Shlach lecha, send thee, more literally, send for yourself. That is, according to your own judgment. I do not command you, but if you wish to do so, send them. So the verse says, God sent them. Rashi says, no. God's not commanding. God's specifically not commanding. That's why the verse says God is commanding, but God is specifically not commanding. You can do so if you want. Okay, so this is fascinating on a number of levels. It's not really what the verse seems to be saying, but that's what the Rashi is saying the verse is saying. And so now we're going to get into why does Rashi interpret it this way? Okay, we're continuing. We're on the first page of the source sheet still. So God said this because the Israelites came to Moses and said, we will send men before us, etc., as it is said in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 22. So this is the same section that our Eitz Chaim Chumash is pointing at, chapter 1 in Deuteronomy, verses 22 and 23. So we'll look at that a little bit later. But God said this because the Israelites came to Moses and said, "We will send men before us," as it is said in Deuteronomy chapter 1. "And you approached me, all of you, saying, 'We will send men,' etc. And Moses took counsel with God, whereupon God said to them," okay, so before we turn to the next page and we continue, we'll just check in with where we are. So in Deuteronomy chapter 1, the story is retold a little bit differently. Here in Numbers chapter 13, it's God's idea. In chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, it's the people's idea. Okay, and so this is the question that's still in the back of our minds, in the front of our hearts. How did this become such a disaster? How did the situation even unfold? This was a terrible consequence that we're wandering for 40 years in the desert. It's also pretty bad that God promised us this land and we're like, well, we're not sure. We're going to have to check that out first. I don't really know if I want this gift. Right? And so these are the questions that we're struggling with and we're trying to answer. And Rashi's interpretation answers, or at least speaks to, these questions in a fairly convincing way. You know, there's no perfect answer, but Rashi's answer is pretty good. So now we turn the page 2. So God said, "I have told them," the Jewish people, "long ago that the land is good. I already promised it to them, as it is said in Exodus chapter 3, verse 17, 'I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt unto a land flowing with milk and honey.'" We know that this is a thing. God has we revisit this promise all the time in our prayers and in our thinking. And so, and this is a little moment of translation, "By their lives I swear." And so the Hebrew for this is chayechem she, which I think a better translation is sort of like "gosh darn it" or "dag nabbit," or perhaps something a little bit stronger. But so God is swearing that I, God, will give them now an opportunity to fall into error through the statements of the spies, so that they should not come into possession of the land. So God is trying to give us his gift. We're like, I'm not so sure about this. God's like, dag nabbit, maybe you won't get this gift after all. It's pretty bad. It's just like that. Okay, so this became a disaster. This whole situation became a disaster. This is Rashi's answer, because the people didn't trust God and God got angry. And so if we look a little bit further in our parasha, chapter 14, verses 32 through 35, indeed, God does get angry. And so this answer that Rashi is giving agrees with what we read later, where God gets very angry and says, here's your punishment. So this idea of God being punishing is sort of the drawback to this correct answer to the question that Rashi gives. It's a fairly good answer because it explains the punishment, but we have this idea that we've got to fold into it, which is that God is mean. And so that's an idea that it's certainly popular in rabbinic tradition and in interpretive tradition of Rashi, the medieval tradition, but we have problems with it throughout the ages, and it's not so popular today. We want to think of God as a loving God, so Rashi's answer isn't perfect. It has some benefits and some drawbacks. Okay, so now we're going to read on page 2 just to give ourselves a little bit more context. These verses that Rashi is referencing and our Eitz Chaim commentary is referencing. This is when the people asked Moses for permission, so to speak, for help scouting the land. So 22, "Then all of you came to me," meaning Moses, "and said, 'Let us send agents ahead to reconnoiter the land for all of us and bring back word on the route we shall follow and the cities we shall come to.' And Moses approves of the plan, and so I," meaning Moses, "selected 12 of you, one representative from each tribe." And so I think it's interesting that in both tellings of the story, the one in Numbers and the one in Deuteronomy, Moses is the one choosing 12 scouts, one for each tribe. So there's a common thread there. All right. So now let's move it on to page 3, because this is the question, whose idea was this, was our first question. But I think a question that we can't really separate out from that is, how did this happen? How did this become such a disaster? How precisely did this disaster unfold? What was the exact sequence of events that led to this problem? And borrowing a phrase from my teacher, Rabbi Paul Steinberg, what was the exact sequence of events? So we're going to look at both stories. The story from this week's parasha is a little bit more lengthy. The story from Deuteronomy is shorter. So we'll start with the story from this week's parasha. Okay, verse 25. "At the end of 40 days, they returned from scouting the land. They went straight to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran, and they made their report to them and to the whole community as they showed them the fruit of the land." This is what they told them, him or them. "We came to the land you sent us to. It does indeed flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, The people who inhabit the country are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakites there. Amalekites dwell in the Negev region. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites inhabit the hill country, and Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Okay, so this report, just kind of checking in with the rest of the parasha, Moses gives the spies instructions a little bit earlier than this in verses 17 through 20, and the spies are basically doing what Moses has asked them to do. We're working with the plan at this point, but don't worry, things are about to go horribly wrong. We turn the page. Caleb hushed the people before Moses. This is where it takes a turn, and it takes a turn starting with optimism. You know, I like to believe in optimism, but we all know sometimes it doesn't work out, right? So Caleb hushes the people before Moses and says he's about to be optimistic. Let us by all means go up. We shall gain possession of it. We shall surely overcome it. Yes, this people is strong, but it's no problem. We got this, people. Verse 31, but the other men who had gone up with Caleb said, we cannot attack that people, for it is stronger than we. Caleb is optimistic. Everyone else is pessimistic. So you might have already picked this up, but a little bit later, chapter 14, verses 6 through 7, Joshua and Caleb, the two of them are both optimistic. So we see a little variation of the story within our variation of the story. But Caleb is optimistic here. Everyone else is pessimistic, and pessimism wins out. So now as we go from verse 31 to verse 32, we're going to go beyond pessimism. Here we go. Thus they, meaning the other scouts, spread calumnies among the Israelites about the land that they had scouted, saying, the country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. All the people that we saw in it are of astonishingly great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The Anakites are part of the Nephilim, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. This idea, we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. We have a lot of contemporary interpretations, whether it's misperceptions, whether it's not believing in yourself, it's about self-esteem, whether it's about body image. I've seen some interesting drashot on this specific error in perception that really is a huge downfall. So I brought the definition I couldn't resist of calumnies, because what is a calumny? Is it just a lie? Not exactly. It's a false and malicious statement designed to injure the reputation of someone or something. And if we look at the Hebrew for this word, dibah, here it's in the construct form, dibat, but dibah is a slander, a malicious report or rumor to damage reputation. It's a little bit more than a lie, so we can't really translate it as lie. Hence, every year we have to look up what does calumny mean. So we're slandering the land that God has given us, and obviously, this is really bad. It continues to beg the question, because we don't really ever find a quite satisfying answer. How did this become such a disaster? We keep asking this question throughout the ages. We keep coming up with answers. They're all almost good enough, and so we continue our quest to understand, right? So now let's move to page 5. Here is the story from, as our Eitz Chaim says, the tradition recorded in Deuteronomy. This is the version of this from the version of the story that Rashi referenced in the commentary on the first page of our source sheet. And this is a much shorter version of the story, which I love. All right, verse 25 in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy. They took some of the fruit of the land with them and brought it down to us, and they gave us this report. It is a good land that God is giving to us. Fascinating. We have, like, instead of 10 verses that are all full of controversy and end up being pretty explosive, we had one verse that is very straightforward. This is good. God said it was going to be good. It's good. It's that simple. In this version of the story, here's the problem. It's not with the 10 spies, it's with the people. Yet you, the Jewish people, refused to go up and flouted the command of your God. So this story is much simpler, much shorter, and it places blame differently. Not on the spies. In this story, they brought back good reports, and of the people, it was the people who wouldn't listen. And meanwhile, Rashi continues to do this task that Rashi always does of reconciling the two stories. It's not that there are two different tellings of the story. It's that, of course, both these things, they seem to be different versions of the story, but actually, here's how it all makes sense, and it's the simple meaning of the verse or something. This is Rashi on Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 25. And they said the land is good. Who were they who spoke of it being good? Well, Joshua and Caleb, agreeing with our parasha, chapter 14 of the book of Numbers. So it wasn't actually all 12 of the spies. Of course, it was just 2, obviously, and that's why Rashi says so. And so Rashi highlights this word vitamaru. This is an expression, the last thing on the source sheet, denoting setting oneself in opposition. You opposed yourselves to God's words. We flouted this command. Okay, so coming towards the end of our learning, what are our takeaways? So one takeaway, if you didn't already know about Rashi before today, now you know Rashi is our baseline correct answer. Our Eitz Chaim Chumash, which has 3 different commentaries, which I think are also wonderful, it acknowledges different traditions, and that's what we read on page 840 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. But Rashi doesn't acknowledge different traditions. Rashi's approach is to reconcile them. Here's how it all makes sense together, which creates some interesting moments of creative interpretation. And here's the takeaway that, I wish were more conclusive, but it isn't. How did this disaster happen? We've got a variety of answers there. If you want to look at more, there are some great answers on page 840. There are some great answers on page 844. And then we have Rashi's answer, we didn't listen to God, therefore we're punished. None of these answers are quite satisfying. Okay, when bad things happen, whether it's a failure of leadership or whether it's something a little bit more personal, we don't always know or understand why. But Torah motivates us to continue to try to understand. We have this tradition of interpretation where we continue to try to understand even when it's not necessarily an answerable question. And this reminds us that even though the problems that we're facing in our current day and age seem so insurmountable, humans have faced these problems before, and it reminds us that we're not alone. So as we go into this new week together, I bless us all to take this learning and remember we're not alone. Shabbat Shalom.